Graham Whitlock stood in the garage with the engine of his truck still ticking as it cooled, a manila envelope resting flat against his palm. Inside, it were the only 6 pages that mattered anymore, signed, notarized, ready to be filed the next morning at the Hamilton County Courthouse. He had read them so many times in the lawyer's office that the language had stopped sounding legal and started sounding like a verdict. Petitioner. Respondent. Irreconcilable differences. For 18 years, Renata Whitlock had been the one fixed point in a life that otherwise moved fast and asked for too much. But for the last 14 months, his wife had become a woman he recognized only by her silhouette in doorways. No more falling asleep with her hand resting on his chest. No more humming while she cooked. She had started taking calls in the bathroom with the fan running, like the sound of running water could swallow whatever she didn't want him to hear. Graham was an actuary. His entire career was built on probability, reading patterns in data that most people couldn't see, predicting the moment a risk stopped being manageable and became inevitable. Tonight, sitting in his own driveway with his headlights off, he had finally run the numbers on his marriage and didn't like the answer. He came in through the mudroom door instead of the front, the way he always did when he didn't want to be heard before he was ready to be seen. The kitchen smelled like the lemon dish soap Renata always used, and for one unguarded second that smell did something soft and dangerous to his resolve. He stood very still in the hallway, envelope against his thigh. That's when he heard her voice. Before this story goes any further, if you're new to this channel, go ahead and hit subscribe. Hearts and Shadows is built on stories exactly like this one, the kind that crack you open before they put you back together. Now, back to that kitchen in Cincinnati. The voice was coming from the back porch, low and cracked in a way Graham had never once heard from his wife in 18 years of marriage. Not the clipped, careful tone she'd used with him for over a year. This was raw, frightened. Yvette, I can't keep doing this by myself. Yvette. Renata's co-worker from the billing department at St. Anne's, a woman Graham had met maybe 4 times, a name that had been showing up on the phone bill at hours that didn't make sense for 2 women who worked the same 8 to 4 shift. He's about to file, Yvette, I know it. I can see it in how he looks at me now, like he's already grieving something. A long breath shaking. But I can't tell him. Not after what happened with Toby the last time. Not after the promise I made him. Graham's hand tightened on the envelope until the paper inside crackled. 3 months, Renata went on, voice breaking. 3 months I've been driving out to that facility twice a week and lying about where I am. I didn't want Graham carrying this. Not after everything with his own brother. I didn't want him looking at me the way he looked at Marcus when he finally gave up on him. Marcus, his brother, a name Graham hadn't said out loud in 6 years. The anger he'd been carrying for 14 months. Every cold dinner, every silence at the kitchen table. Every night she came home smelling like a different building than the hospital. Drained out of him in one long, terrible exhale. This wasn't an affair. This was something else entirely. Something that had been hiding in plain sight the whole time, wearing the costume of betrayal, because betrayal was the only shape Graham's fear knew how to take. He hadn't been losing his wife to another man. His wife had been carrying something alone, something that touched the one wound in their family neither of them had ever learned how to talk about. Stay right where you are, because what Graham discovers over the next several hours is going to change the way you understand everything you think you know about this marriage. To understand how a careful, methodical man like Graham Whitlock ended up standing in his own hallway holding divorce papers, you have to go back to where the first hairline crack actually appeared. Not the moment it became impossible to ignore. The moment it was small enough that he almost let it go. 14 months earlier, the Whitlock house had felt as stable as anything Graham had ever built a spreadsheet around. He'd just made senior partner at Bellwether and Cross, the firm he'd given 15 years to, the milestone his late father used to ask about every single Sunday dinner before the stroke took him 3 years back. "You've got the head for numbers, son. Don't let anybody talk you out of using it," Renata had cried when he told her. Made his favorite dinner, braised short ribs, the cheddar grits her grandmother used to make, and looked at him across the table like he'd just hung the moon over downtown Cincinnati. Their daughter, Skylar, 13 at the time, had taped a hand-drawn card to the refrigerator that just said, "Partner, Daddy," in glitter glue. That was the last easy night Graham could remember with any clarity. 2 weeks later, small things started disappearing. The kiss at the door before he left for the office. The way she used to leave her phone face up on the counter, unbothered. He told himself it was stress. Her hospital had just gone through a brutal round of layoffs in the billing department. Survivor's guilt was a real thing, he'd read about it. He let it go. Then she started staying up later than him, then going to bed before him, the two of them passing like shift workers in their own home. She flinched, almost imperceptibly, when he reached for her hand across the console of the car. She started taking calls outside, in the garage, in the car in the driveway with the windows up. One evening, Skylar wandered into the kitchen while Graham was eating reheated leftovers alone. "Are you and Mom okay?" she asked, too quietly for a 13-year-old who should have still believed her parents were unshakable. He pulled her into a hug that felt more like he needed it than she did. "Daddy's just trying to figure some things out, baby. Don't worry about grown folks' business." The words felt hollow even as he said them. He couldn't find the source of the break. And for a man whose entire professional life was built on finding the variable that explained the outcome, not knowing the cause of his own collapsing marriage was its own particular kind of torment. Let's step outside the story for just a second. What Graham was experiencing has an actual name in family psychology: ambiguous loss, a concept developed by researcher Dr. Pauline Boss. It describes the specific agony of losing someone who is still physically present. The person is right there across the table, sleeping 6 inches away, but emotionally somewhere you can't follow. What makes it so corrosive is that it's almost impossible to grieve. You can't mourn someone standing in your kitchen. So the partner left on the outside starts manufacturing explanations, because an unexplained absence is harder to live with than almost any explanation, even a painful one. For Graham, the explanation his mind manufactured was suspicion. He started noticing the call logs, not snooping exactly, at least that's what he told himself, just glancing, the way he'd glance at a spreadsheet that didn't add up. Yvette's number, sure, that made sense. But there was another number too, area code unfamiliar, showing up 2, sometimes 3 times a week, always between 9 and 11 at night. This is where a second pattern enters the picture, what psychologists call the demand-withdraw cycle. One partner senses distance and starts pursuing, asking questions, looking for clues. The other, drowning in whatever they're protecting, pulls back harder. Each pursuit deepens the retreat. Each retreat intensifies the pursuit. What looks from the outside like a marriage falling apart is often just 2 people trapped in the same loop, each one's fear producing exactly the reaction they're most afraid of. Renata's silence made Graham more suspicious. His growing coldness made her retreat further into whatever she was hiding. Neither one of them realized they were doing it to each other in real time. He started noticing other things he'd brushed past before. The way she came home some nights with red, swollen eyes and said it was allergies in October. The way she'd started parking 2 blocks from the house on certain evenings, like she needed the walk to compose herself before she came inside. He clocked every one of these details and said nothing, every single time. He called his sister-in-law, Odessa, Renata's mother's oldest friend, close enough to the family that everyone just called her Miss Odessa, twice, fishing without really fishing. She told him Renata seemed fine to her. He didn't believe it, but he didn't push. Eventually, he called a divorce attorney instead. Not out of fury. The fury had burned itself out somewhere around month 9. What was left by month 13 was colder than anger. The bone-deep exhaustion of a man who had been knocking politely on a locked door for over a year and had finally accepted no one was going to open it. He met with the lawyer twice, started quietly separating their finances, careful and fair about it, the way he did everything. He almost told his pastor, Reverend Booker, but couldn't get the words out past the lump in his throat, so instead he just asked for prayer, for my household, vague enough to mean nothing and everything. Now, standing frozen in that hallway with October air sliding through the cracked porch door and his wife's voice spilling out into the kitchen, 14 months of suspicion collapsed into something Graham had no name for. He backed away quietly, went back out to the garage, sat down on the cold concrete next to his truck, put his face in both hands and cried for the first time since they buried his father. He cried for every frozen dinner he'd read as rejection, for every theory of betrayal he'd quietly built while the real story, terrifying, exhausting, devastatingly loyal, was unfolding 3 rooms away from him the entire time. He had been preparing to leave his wife. His wife had been driving out to a treatment facility twice a week to sit with her addict brother, alone, because she was terrified of what it would do to her marriage if Graham found out. When the tears finally stopped, the actuary in him took back over. If the foundation was compromised, he needed the full data set before he touched anything else. He needed the whole truth, not the fragment he'd just overheard through a cracked door. Has anyone in your life ever tried to protect you by going silent, and it ended up hurting worse than the truth would have? Drop your story in the comments, or just type stayed or walked. He sat out in that garage until well past midnight, heard Renata come back in from the porch, the soft, careful movements of a woman who'd long since stopped expecting anyone to notice whether she was home or not. The bedroom light clicked on under the hallway door. The shower ran. Then quiet. Graham let the engineer-brained part of himself do what it always did, survey the whole structure before he laid a hand on anything. He waited until the light went dark, then waited another full hour after that. When he finally went inside, he stood at the bedroom door and listened to Renata's slow, exhausted breathing. He eased the door open just enough to see her, curled on her side, facing from him, knees pulled up toward her chest, the way someone sleeps when they're still holding something together, even unconscious. He pulled the door shut without a sound and went and sat at the kitchen table until the sky outside the window turned from black to pale gray. The next evening, Graham came home at his usual time and moved through the house like the night before hadn't happened. After Skylar disappeared into her room, he sat at the kitchen table with his hands folded and waited. Renata came down the hallway eventually, moving with that same careful economy she'd had for over a year, like she was rationing her own energy. She stopped when she saw him sitting there. Something moved across her face, fear, guilt, exhaustion, all landing at once. She reached for the counter to steady herself, set her phone face down beside her, without seeming to notice she'd done it. Graham's voice came out quiet, level. The voice of a man who'd already used up every tear he had. I heard you on the phone with Yvette last night. The color left Renata's face. Her knees buckled slightly. She caught the edge of the counter with both hands and stood there a moment, with her head down, breathing in short, shallow pulls. Then she lowered herself into the chair across from him, the way a person sits down when the last piece of holding it together finally gives way. The tears came fast, not the careful private kind she'd been rationing for 14 months. These were the heaving, full-body sobs of a secret that had gotten too heavy to carry alone. It's Toby, she whispered. He relapsed 14 months ago, right after your promotion, right after we'd just started feeling like things were finally good again. She pressed both hands over her mouth. I couldn't tell you, Graham. You'd just made partner. You were working 60-hour weeks, and you'd just gone through everything with Marcus. Her voice cracked open. I watched what that did to you. I watched you grieve a brother who was still alive. I couldn't put you through that twice. Let's step outside the story here for a moment. Because what Renata just described is one of the most well-documented patterns in family systems work, what therapists sometimes call the protector trap. It happens when someone who loves deeply convinces themselves that hiding pain is the same thing as love. That suffering quietly, alone, is a gift they're giving the people they care about most. From the inside, the logic feels noble. It feels like sacrifice. But what the research consistently shows is this: hidden suffering never actually stays hidden. It reshapes how a person moves through a house. It changes eye contact, touch, the rhythm of ordinary conversation. It doesn't disappear into silence. It transforms into the exact damage the person was trying so hard to prevent. Distance. Suspicion. Grief, with nowhere to land. Renata hid Toby's relapse because she loved Graham completely, and in doing that, she accidentally built the very conditions that nearly ended their marriage. This isn't a character flaw. It's a deeply human response, especially in someone who's already watched addiction tear through one family before. Renata had grown up watching her own father's drinking hollow out her childhood home. She knew exactly what relapse could do to a family that wasn't braced for it. And Graham's history with his own brother only confirmed her worst fear, that if she told him the truth, he might do to Toby exactly what he'd done to Marcus. Cut him off, walk away clean, protect his own peace. So she decided to carry it by herself. The tragedy is that Graham's instinct, faced with her growing distance, was equally old, equally inherited. He didn't ask. He endured. He analyzed from a careful distance the way he'd been raised to handle anything that scared him. Two people, two survival strategies, both rooted in love, both pointed in completely opposite directions, and both of them quietly working at the exact same time in the same house, nearly tearing it apart. Graham rose from his chair, crossed the kitchen without a word, wrapped both arms around his wife for the first time in 14 months. She shook against him, gripping the back of his shirt and holding on like she was afraid letting go would undo something. Neither of them spoke for a long time. When she finally steadied, he pulled back just enough to look at her directly. "Is he okay? Right now, tonight, is Toby okay?" "He's in the program," she said softly. "Day 41. I go on Tuesdays and Saturdays for family visiting hours." Graham nodded slowly. "What else, Renata? What else haven't you told me?" She looked down at her hands. "I took out a loan against my 401k, she said, to cover the part of the facility insurance wouldn't touch." A beat of silence. "How much?" She didn't answer right away, and her silence was answer enough. "Almost all of it. 11 years of retirement contributions, quietly liquidated to keep her brother in a bed at a recovery center 40 minutes outside the city. Converted without Graham's knowledge into a debt she'd been planning to pay back alone, in secret, for years if that's what it took." His hands went flat and still on the table, the stillness of a man exercising enormous control. Then he picked up his phone and called Miss Odessa. "I need you to tell me the truth about something," he said, voice carrying everything underneath it. "Did you know about Toby?" There was a pause, then her voice, careful and low. "What happened?" "Renata's been driving out there for 3 months. I didn't know." A longer pause this time, heavier. "I knew," Miss Odessa finally said. "I've known since the night he called her from the hospital. She made me promise not to say a word to you." The kitchen went completely silent. And here's where a third psychological principle enters this story, one just as important as the first two. Family therapists sometimes call it the family secret system. When a household is facing a serious crisis, addiction, illness, shame, the fear of losing someone who holds everything together, family members will often, without ever sitting down and formally agreeing to it, organize themselves around a shared secret. One person decides to protect the most vulnerable member, another gets pulled in to help carry the weight, then another. Slowly, quietly, without a single conversation in which everyone actually consents, the whole family seals itself around a silence. The people inside that circle believe they're doing something loving. In their own way, they usually are. But every person brought inside absorbs a portion of the emotional weight. And every person left outside, like Graham, starts to feel the shape of something they can't see or name. They know something is wrong, they just don't know what. And that formless, sourceless anxiety is often more psychologically damaging than the truth itself ever would have been. Graham had been the only person in his own family not trusted with the truth about his own family. He'd been protected from something that belonged to him as much as anyone. Hold on, because when Graham drives across town to see Toby that same night, what's waiting for him is going to reveal a layer of this story nobody saw coming. He drove with both hands on the wheel and the radio off. The radio always told you everything about where Graham was emotionally. Gospel or old soul on the easy days, dead silence when he needed to think something through alone. The recovery facility was a converted Victorian on the edge of Clifton, porch light burning even at this hour. A counselor let him into a small visiting room with 2 chairs and a box of tissues that had clearly seen heavy use. Toby came in a few minutes later, thinner than Graham remembered, eyes clearer than they'd been in years, hands shaking slightly the way they did now, even sober. He sat down across from Graham and didn't say anything for a long moment. "She didn't want you to know," Toby finally said. "I told her she had to tell you. She wouldn't listen." "Why not?" Toby looked at the floor. "Because of Marcus," he said quietly. "Because she watched what it did to you when you finally gave up on your own brother. She was scared if you found out about me, you'd make her choose. And she didn't think she could survive choosing." Graham sat with that for a long time. His brother's story. He knew the broad shape of it. Marcus had cycled through 3 different programs over 6 years before Graham finally stopped answering the phone, told himself it was for his own sanity, told himself it was the responsible thing to do. He hadn't realized that decision had been quietly living inside his marriage the whole time, shaping what Renata thought she had to hide from him. "She should have trusted me," Graham said. "Maybe," Toby said, "but you have to understand what it looks like from the outside, watching somebody you love walk away from family because the pain got to be too much. She wasn't protecting me from you, man. She was protecting you from having to do that again." Graham found out the rest from Skylar that same night. She was still awake when he got home, sitting up in bed with her knees pulled to her chest, lamp burning low. He sat on the edge of the bed the way he had since she was small. "Talk to me, baby." In a careful, quiet voice, the voice of a kid who's been carrying something too heavy for too long. She told him she'd known for 2 months. She'd overheard her mother on the phone with Toby late one night, crying, and had pieced the rest together from things that didn't add up. "She made me promise not to tell you," Skylar said. "She said you were already carrying enough. Did that feel right to you? Keeping that from me?" Skylar shook her head, tears sliding silently down her face. "No, it felt like I was lying to you every single day. I didn't know what to do, Dad. I'm sorry." Graham pulled his daughter into his arms. "You don't owe me a single apology. Not one." He held her until she stopped shaking, and sitting there in the low lamplight, he understood the full shape of what had been quietly built around him without his knowledge. An entire family reorganizing itself around one act of protection, every person shielding him from the same fear, every one of them, out of love, cutting him off from the very people he would have moved heaven to support if he'd just been asked. Stepping outside the story for a moment, because what just happened illustrates something important about how families actually work under pressure. Secrecy doesn't contain pain, it spreads it. It settles into the posture of a 14-year-old who's stopped sleeping well. It widens the distance between 2 people who love each other and no longer know how to close the gap. Children absorb what adults refuse to say out loud. They feel the tension long before anyone explains its source. Graham went straight to the bedroom when he got home. Renata was sitting up, waiting. She'd heard the truck come and go. He sat beside her on the edge of the bed. His voice cracked just once. "You really thought I couldn't handle this?" No, she said, shaking her head. I thought you'd already paid this particular debt once. I thought I was protecting you from having to grieve a brother twice. You were protecting me from my own family, he said, from the people who needed me most. She had no answer for that, only tears. Then, slowly, with the specific shame of someone finally laying down the thing they'd worked hardest to keep hidden, Renata reached over and pulled the loan paperwork out of her nightstand drawer and set it on the bed between them. Months of statements, the slow bleeding out of 11 years of savings. I felt like such a failure, she whispered, watching it disappear and not being able to tell you why. Graham broke completely then. He pulled her against his chest and let his own tears fall without trying to hold them back this time. No composure left, nothing held in reserve. We're going to fix this, he said, together, starting tonight. Both of them wept, and in that shared, unguarded moment, something that had been sealed tight for 14 months finally cracked open. Here, one final psychological truth becomes clear, what some therapists call silent strength syndrome, the deeply ingrained belief, especially in families shaped by generations of hardship, that showing vulnerability is the same thing as being weak, that a good partner endures privately, that the most loving thing you can do is suffer where no one else has to watch. Renata hid her brother's relapse because she feared honesty would cost her the marriage. Graham buried his own pain because he believed a husband holds the house together without ever showing the strain. Both of them were running the exact same inherited script, both suffering alone for the exact same reason. Love pointed in the wrong direction. I've been scared for 14 months, Graham said quietly, and I didn't know how to say it out loud. She leaned her forehead against his. Me too. Then Renata's phone buzzed on the nightstand. She glanced at the screen, and her hand went still. It's the facility. Graham nodded. She answered on speaker, and they sat side by side on the edge of the bed and listened together. The voice on the other end carried good news in its very first sentence. Mrs. Whitlock, I'm calling to let you know Toby completed his 45-day evaluation today. He's been cleared to move into the outpatient phase next week. He's doing exceptionally well. Renata folded forward, both hands over her face, shoulders heaving with relief. Graham wrapped both arms around her and held on with everything he had. After a long moment, she lifted her face and whispered, I had a whole plan. If he made it through this, I was going to ask you if we could renew our vows. Start the next part of this marriage honestly, for once. He looked at her in the gray early light. Then that's exactly what we're going to do. Stay with this story, because the months of healing this family builds next are going to restore something in you about what real love actually looks like. They talked through the rest of that night, not the careful, guarded talking they'd been doing for over a year, every sentence measured with one eye on the door, but the other kind, the kind that happens when everything is finally out in the open and there's nothing left to protect. Renata told him about the night she found out, sitting alone in the hospital parking garage for almost an hour after Toby's call, not knowing yet how to carry what she'd just learned. She told him she'd called Yvette first, because Yvette had a brother in recovery too, and would understand without falling apart. She'd called Miss Odessa next, because Miss Odessa was the kind of woman who could absorb a family's grief and keep her hands perfectly steady while she did it. Why not me? Graham asked. Not an accusation, a real question. Renata looked at her hands for a long moment before answering. Because with Yvette and Miss Odessa, I could fall apart and put myself back together before anyone saw me the next morning. But with you, I was scared if I came apart in front of you, I'd never get put back together, because watching you carry that weight would hurt worse than the situation itself. I know that doesn't make sense. It makes sense, he said. It doesn't mean it was right, but it makes sense. He told her in return what the last 14 months had looked like from his side of the silence. The suspicion, the call logs, the lawyer, the divorce papers sitting in the glove box of his truck right now. He didn't spare her any of it. He watched her face while he spoke and let her feel the full weight, not to punish her, but because she deserved to know the cost of the silence, the same way he now knew the cost of hers. When he finished, she was quiet a long time. Then, very softly, "There were nights I almost left first. I thought about it. Releasing you before you had to watch this get harder. I thought, he doesn't know the real reason for the distance. He's going to draw his own conclusions. And maybe the kindest thing I can do is let him go before it gets worse. Why didn't you? Because I still loved you too much to do it. And I was terrified that if I told you the truth, you'd stay anyway, but only out of obligation. I couldn't build a marriage on pity." Graham stared at the wall for a moment. Two people, the same house, the same wound, approached from opposite directions. Both of them so devoted to protecting each other that they'd nearly destroyed the very thing they were trying to save. The next morning, Graham stood at the kitchen counter, holding the divorce papers one final time. Skylar sat at the table over her cereal, watching him over the rim of her bowl with careful eyes. Renata stood in the bedroom doorway in her robe, both hands wrapped around a coffee mug, watching too. He held the papers up just long enough for both of them to see clearly. Then he tore them in half. Then in half again until the pieces were too small to tear anymore, and let them fall into the recycling bin. Skylar was out of her chair before the last piece hit the bottom, crossing the kitchen in 3 steps to throw her arms around both her parents at once. A 14-year-old who'd been holding her breath for months, finally exhaling completely. "We're okay now, right?" she said into the middle of it, muffled but perfectly clear. Renata laughed, a real laugh, full and unguarded, the first one Graham had heard in over a year, and pressed her face into his shoulder. He held them both and looked up at the ceiling and just thought, "Thank you," to no one in particular. Just gratitude, offered to whatever had kept this family standing long enough to reach this morning. A few weeks later, Graham organized a small gathering at New Covenant Baptist, where Reverend Booker led a service of healing for the family. Standing in front of a congregation that had watched the Whitlocks grow up inside those walls, Graham spoke honestly for the first time about what the last 14 months had actually been. "I almost walked away from my family," he said, "because I stopped asking the right questions. I built a whole career on finding the truth buried inside complicated numbers, and I let the most important relationship in my life crack for over a year without once asking what was really happening underneath it." He paused. "From now on, we carry things together in this house. No more protecting each other with silence." Renata sat in the front pew, tears running freely. Skylar pressed against her mother's side, watching her father at the front with fierce, uncomplicated pride. Miss Odessa worked through a second handkerchief in the 3rd row. And in the back, sober and steady in a way Graham hadn't seen him in years, Toby stood with his hands folded, listening to his sister's husband talk about second chances. The congregation said amen, in the way that means we've been rooting for you the whole time. Now let's step outside the story one final time, because what happened in that church represents something family psychology rarely gets to document so cleanly. A family moving all the way from crisis into genuine restoration. The shift began the moment shame got replaced by shared responsibility. Not blame. Blame looks backward and assigns fault. Shared responsibility looks forward and asks, how do we carry this together from here? What Graham modeled that morning, publicly owning his own role in the silence, his own failure to push past assumption into honest conversation, was the exact thing that gave Renata permission to do the same. And what she did, by finally allowing herself to be fully seen, gave their daughter permission to set down a weight she'd been quietly carrying for months. Healing in families almost never happens in a single moment. It's a long series of choices, made again and again, to keep choosing honesty over the comfort of distance. In the weeks that followed, Graham worked with the firm's HR director to set up a structured payment plan that quietly restored most of what Renata's retirement account had lost, handling it the way he handled everything. without drama, without making her feel small about it. He simply fixed it and moved on. The way a man handles things, he considers his own responsibility now too. He also started showing up to family visiting hours with Renata on Saturdays, sitting across from Toby in that small room with the well-used tissue box, learning slowly how to be present for someone he'd once decided he couldn't afford to keep loving. It wasn't easy. There were Saturdays he almost didn't go, but he went anyway, every time, because he'd learned the hard way what it cost a family when love went quiet instead of staying close. Together, Graham and Renata started meeting with Reverend Booker for counseling. Not because the marriage was still in crisis, but because they'd both learned, at considerable cost, that love isn't self-sustaining. It needs tending. It needs the willingness to speak honestly, even when honesty is uncomfortable. Even when silence feels like the kinder option in the moment. For two people raised to absorb difficulty without showing it, Graham in the tradition of the provider, who holds everything together without complaint, Renata in the tradition of the caregiver, who gives and gives without ever asking for anything back, learning to actually receive, turned out to be the hardest and most necessary work of all. They started inviting Toby and Yvette and Miss Odessa back to regular Sunday dinners. Awkward at first. There were conversations that took real courage just to start. But they started them anyway, and slowly, carefully, the hard conversations became opportunities for repair instead of blame. The table got louder again. Skylar started doing her homework at the kitchen counter, the way she had when she was small, just to be near people. Stepping outside the story one last time, because this final stretch of the Whitlocks' journey illustrates one of the most consistently documented truths in family psychology. Real forgiveness isn't the erasure of pain. It isn't pretending the wound never happened, and it isn't performing cheerfulness over the top of something still unprocessed. Real forgiveness, the kind that actually holds, is the decision to rebuild trust while fully acknowledging the damage. To say, this happened, it cost us something real, and I am choosing to move forward with you anyway. 6 months after that night in the garage, on a warm Saturday evening in late spring, Graham and Renata Whitlock stood in their backyard in front of the people who mattered most and renewed their vows. Small, unhurried, no production to it. Reverend Booker presided, his voice carrying the particular warmth of a man officiating something he genuinely believed in. Miss Odessa had been at the house since morning, arranging flowers with the quiet authority of a woman who treats hosting as a form of prayer. Toby stood near the back, 11 months sober now, crying without embarrassment. Skylar stood beside her mother in a yellow dress she'd picked out herself, holding the rings like she understood exactly what they represented. Not just that evening, but every difficult day it had taken to get there. Graham held his wife's hands under the gold evening light. "I used to think you'd stopped loving me," he said, voice steady but his eyes bright. "Now I understand you loved me so completely you were willing to carry all of it alone. The fear, the debt, the fight to save your own brother, just to keep me standing. I'm asking you, right here, in front of everyone who has ever loved us, to never do that again. Whatever comes next, we carry it together. That's the only foundation I want." Renata smiled at him through tears she had no intention of stopping. "Thank you for listening," she whispered, "and thank you for staying." Skylar cheered loud enough for the whole block to hear. Miss Odessa started the amen before Reverend Booker even finished the blessing. The recovery had held. The marriage had held. The crack that had once seemed wide enough to swallow everything had become, in every way that actually mattered, the strongest part of the foundation. But just when life had settled into something warm and whole, when Sunday dinners ran loud again, and the couch was only for sitting, never sleeping, Graham's phone buzzed late one evening while Renata's head rested against his shoulder on the living room couch, the television murmuring low. The kind of ordinary good evening he'd stopped believing was possible somewhere around month 6 of the silence. He glanced at the screen. Unknown number. A text, Graham, you still don't know everything about those 14 months. It wasn't only Toby. There's something else your family's been keeping from you, and it goes back further than you think. He read it once, then again. Set the phone face down on the cushion beside him, slowly. Renata felt the change in his posture and lifted her head. What is it? He held her gaze a moment before he picked the phone back up and let her read it. Her face went still. Her hand, resting in his, tightened just slightly. And when her smile came back, it arrived half a second too late to mean nothing.